Notes. Welcome everybody to Burgundy Basics. We'll send out the recording with follow-up notes sometime tomorrow, and you'll be able to access that to watch again if you prefer. If you have any questions after class, please feel free to reach out to me. If you want to ask questions during class, use the chat box. Sometimes your wine community will answer those questions as well if I don't see it right away. But also feel free to just take yourself off mute if you want to go ahead and ask a question out loud. That's not a problem for us at all. So we have 1 hour only to talk about Burgundy. That's not very much time. We could probably spend an hour a day for the rest of our lives talking about Burgundy and not explore the entire region. Let's just go ahead and dive right into it, right? Like, why shouldn't we? So I'm gonna just go ahead and share my screen. Sorry, sometimes it just takes a moment for me to get myself set up. So let's just start talking about Burgundy, right? Like, why wouldn't we? It's one of the things I like to do sometimes is talk a little bit about the philosophy of the region that we're going to be discussing, that we're going to be talking about, right? And I think there's a lot of philosophy as it applies to Burgundy. What we'll talk about today is the history of the region, who was here, where did the grape come from, really have an effect on the wine that we have today. The people that lived within this region and the way that they promoted the wines of Burgundy over time really grew to what we have today in our market. We talk about how the climate and the geology affect what we drink, and the notion of terroir. Now, terroir is a French term. It is kind of an idea that we see used in every wine growing region within France, and really every agricultural region within France, right? When we talk about terroir, it's not a term that's exclusive to wine. It's a term that we use to describe herbs, like herb de Provence, right? Herb coming from the region of Provence. Dijon mustard, things like époisse or specific types of cheeses. Those also sort of adhere to an appellation system based on the idea that the terroir, the land that they come from, give them their character. But when we talk about wine, Burgundy is really one of the most important areas for terroir within France. Nothing is arbitrary when it comes to the land in Burgundy. Everything is related to the land, all of the names, all of the wines, all of the places, everything is about this patch of land where the vines grow here. So the notion of terroir is extremely important within Burgundy, and it's what sets these wines apart. We're talking about two grape varieties that on their own are more nuanced grapes, right? When we talk about Pinot Noir, we really think about the finesse that Pinot Noir has, the nuance and the expression that it shows of the site that it comes from. We'll talk about those grape varieties, right? Two grapes, Pinot Noir, Chardonnay. It's a little bit more complex than that, but since we're going kind of over Burgundy Basics today, I want to keep it as simple as possible. We'll talk about what the other grapes are because you will see them. And today, some of them are really important. If you want to drink one of maybe some of the top producers, Emmanuel Rouget within Burgundy, if you want to drink Hubert Lignier, if you want to drink, many Chevrillon, all of these different producers, you want to drink their white wines, you can probably find their Aligoté for a fraction of the price of their Chardonnay. And I think that that's really exciting. And then we're going to talk about the appellations and the classifications. And this is where we really begin to see the nuance of terroir take place. So where are we? We're in Burgundy. Burgundy is an area that covers essentially 5 subregions within Burgundy itself. So those 5 regions are Chablis, which is up here in the north for Chardonnay only. We'll get into the subregions a little bit later on. We talk about the Côte d'Or, or the Golden Slope. This is the most prestigious area of Burgundy. This is where your your really expensive Grand Cru vineyards are. There are Grand Crus in Chablis. We will discuss those. This is where those, $2 and $3 and $10,000 bottles of wine come from this area, the Côte d'Or, called the Golden Slope. It's split into two main areas, the Côte Nuits and the Côte de Beaune. And then we'll talk about the Côte Chardonnay and Mâcon. And then we will discuss briefly Beaujolais too, because Beaujolais, although focused on a different grape variety, it really is a monovarietal region focused on Gamay. It is politically part of Burgundy, even though the climate and the grapes is a little bit different than what we see further north. So definitely we need to talk about that as well. You can see that we're sort of in a continental, more centralized area of France, and this has a lot to do with the climate of the region. Why is climate important? Well, we talk about climate, we talk about weather. This is why we put a vintage date on a label, right? It tells us what year the grapes were grown and what we might expect because of that year in the life of the grapevine. And so just real quick, if anybody else is joining us at the moment, please drink wine. If you got wine from Cork Fez, they should be open. If you want to enjoy them tonight, you should start drinking them now. If you're drinking your own Burgundy, just enjoy. Cheers to everybody. We'll talk about these wines towards the end of class. So I want to make sure that you know to enjoy them throughout. So this map, I actually really like, not the greatest map, but I really enjoy it because I think it helps sort of simplify those regions that I was discussing, right? So Chablis, the northernmost outpost of Burgundy, 100% white wine from only Chardonnay. The Côte d'Or, which I mentioned here in the north, we have the Côte Nuits. The Côte Nuits is known for the quality of its red wines. It also produces white wine, but in terms of the Grand Cru vineyards located here, and in terms of the prestige of the wine, they're more for the reds. The Côte de Beaune, you got it, just like Beaune. This is sort of white wine territory. They produce red in the Côte de Beaune, but it's known, sort of the opposite of the Côte Nuits, it's really known for the quality of its white wines made from Chardonnay. If we move further south, we have the Côte Chardonnay. And the Côte Chardonnay, this sort of little yellow dotted area, is a kind of a non-contiguous string of vineyards. It's less dependent overall on the economy of the grapevine, but we have 5 villages here that we source wine from. And then in Mâcon, in the Mâcon, this is really white wine territory as well. In Côte Chardonnay, we see red, we see sparkling, we see white. The Mâcon, we're really talking about white, white, white from Chardonnay. They most recently included 22 Premier Cru vineyard sites in the Mâcon, which is really exciting. So you'll begin seeing those. Actually, you should have begun seeing them on labels in 2020. And then, of course, we're going to talk about Beaujolais in the south for the Gamay grape. Closer to the Rhone Valley, we're close to Lyon here, and you do see the style of the wine shifting, but still definitely something to consider and to look for if you want to explore terroir, but you don't want to spend, $2,000 to $10,000 on a bottle of wine, exploring the different kind of Grand Crus of, let's say, Rhone Romani. You can explore the different crus of Beaujolais through the Gamay grape. So anywhere you go within Burgundy, again, we're looking at these grape varieties through the lens of the land. So we can do that in every single area or subregion that we go to. So why is Burgundy the way that it is? We could do a whole class on history. I love history. If you've taken my classes before, you probably have noticed that. But because we have so much to cover in the terms of when we talk about the land and the appellation system, we'll keep it pretty brief today. There is a long history here. One of the most fascinating things about the region of Burgundy, the wine growing region, is they have one of the longest continuous kind of unbroken histories of attempting and frankly succeeding, but to make fine wine. and also to make that fine wine terroir driven. And before anybody is like, whoa, wait, they've been making wine in Georgia for 9,000 years, and they, and Lebanon, and of course places like that. Yes, absolutely. There are other wine regions in the world that date back further, that have a longer history, but I really can't think of another region that's seen kind of a continuous, unbroken history of production that really had primarily focused on a few grape varieties, and also kind of looking at it through the lens of the land, classifying the land, right? So it's really kind of an exciting idea that we've promoted this for so long in this region. The Romans were here, of course. The Romans were everywhere within Europe. They brought grapes with them. It's thought that Pinot Noir might have actually been in Burgundy when the Romans arrived. We know that Pinot Noir is one of our oldest grape varieties. That probably goes back close to two millennia, 2,000 years. One of the oldest grape varieties that we know of, that we still use today. So we have records from the Roman Empire that date production back to 200 AD. And it was really the period after the Dark Ages and during the Middle Ages that we saw Burgundy become what it is today. It's like sort of that beginning development of classifying the land, right? So after the Dark Ages, we had a lot of religion after this kind of like violent and turbulent time, right? So Christian monasteries, the Benedictines, the Citeaux, the Cistercians, they spent time in Burgundy. They needed wine for the sacrament. And this is something that goes back, many, many years before, even Greeks and Romans, and then Christians, that you kind of commune with God, you take God into your body by drinking this wine, right? So we need wine for the sacrament. We began growing a lot more of it in Burgundy. And as these monks are walking through these vineyards, and as they're tasting wines made from the same grape from these different sites, and like if you just look at this hillside, like it's one hillside, right? But the monks noticed that the grapes that were grown, the Pinot Noir that was grown up here, and the Pinot Noir that was grown down here, had different characters and was different in quality. Did it still taste like Pinot Noir? Yes, of course. But they noticed that they might prefer one over the other. One might have a little bit more acidity. One might be more balanced with the tannin. So they begin to develop this idea of terroir, that everything surrounding the grape variety kind of goes into, or growing of the grape goes into how the wine will taste in the bottle. This carries on. We have the Dukes of Burgundy. You probably heard of a succession of 4 dukes that did a lot from about the mid 1300s to the mid 1400s to promote the wines of Burgundy. One of them outlawed Gamay in the Côte d'Or. That moved all the Gamay south to where Beaujolais is now. One of them, with the king, delimited the region of Burgundy, saying if you're going to use specific term for place, the wines had to come from those specific places. So they did quite a bit during this time. And in 1789, we have the French Revolution. So this, again, really changes the course of how Burgundy had become. So in 1789, we see a lot of the land is owned in Burgundy by royalty, by the church. Napoleon seizes a lot of these lands and these vineyards, and he puts them in the hand of the common people, right? We have the French Revolution. In 1804, Napoleon also decrees that a parent must pass on his wealth to all children. So rather than the firstborn inheriting everything, now all of your children, or all of your male heirs, are inheriting a portion of whatever you own. So in Burgundy, in a place that's so important for grape growing, this has to do with vineyards. Now, what happened here was that, one, not all the people that got vineyards were necessarily great at making wine, right? That's one thing. Just because you have a vineyard doesn't mean you know how to grow grapes or make wine. This is why oftentimes you see places where somebody owns a vineyard, but they hire a winemaker to make the wine for their label, right? This is really popular in places like California or Napa Valley. The other thing that happened is, with this Napoleonic code that we call it, now every time a parent is passing away and that land is being passed on to the heirs, it's being divided. It's being fractured over and over and over over time. So in Burgundy, it's important to understand that within these vineyards, a single vineyard can have multiple owners. And also now that of course, with free market, we trade and we purchase vines and parcels of vineyards as we want. We also understand that one producer or one winery or winemaker in Burgundy might make wine from multiple different vineyards. So we'll talk about that in a moment as well. Also, during this time, we see the rise of the negociants. And a negociant is somebody who buys grapes or wine that's already been made and then makes their own wine or sells that wine under their own label. So Louis Jadot is a negociant. Favelet is a negociant, right? They own some of their own vineyards, and you might see Domaine Favelet or Domaine Jadot on the label. But if you don't see that term domain, they're telling you that they purchased the grapes from another grower. Now, the negociants really rose during this time because with this fractured ownership, not everybody that grew grapes had the money or the knowledge or the interest to make their own wine. So a lot of these smaller growers, these vignerons, were selling their grapes to these larger houses. And so that's when we see the negociants, right? In the 1930s, we begin to see a lot of producers within Burgundy that are interested, or I should say grape growers in Burgundy, that are interested in bottling their own wine. So this started with producers like D'Angerville and Volnay, Chevillon and Nuits Saint-Georges. And they said, hold on, we don't want to sell these grapes. We know that these are important vineyards. We're going to work this vineyard ourselves. We'll make the wine. These other domains, they're considered to be like the top of the top in Burgundy. Makes sense, right? Just make sure we got all that. So much to cover. This is the fun part. So now we get into the easy stuff. What are the grapes of Burgundy? You see Bourgogne Rouge, you see Bourgogne Blanc, it's Pinot Noir, and it's Chardonnay. Now, when we talk about the idea of terroir, the reason it's also so prevalent and so important in Burgundy is because, of course, we do notice the difference of these different sites, but we wouldn't notice that subtlety, that nuance of different sites if we weren't using the same grapes, right? We were trying to grow Cabernet, which one won't ripen well in Burgundy, that's why we don't grow it here. But if we were trying to make Cabernet and compare that with a plot of Pinot Noir, a hillside down, the differences would be so stark because those are different grape varieties that feel very different on the palate, that have very different flavors, that you wouldn't notice that nuance in terroir, right? So the idea of terroir in Burgundy really has to do with, again, the place as it relates to the soil, the weather, the aspect, how it faces the sun, the grape variety that we're using as this looking glass, Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, but also in Burgundy, we have such a long, unbroken history of production here. We also have that human element of expertise. We have a history of experienced wine production in Burgundy. We have a history of nepotism in Burgundy, right? Training your children to work your land and in the cellar and take over your vines. And all of those kind of three things together come to make these fantastic wines. You will also see Gamay is another red grape. In the Côte d'Or,
you better get a rerun on it.
You have a question?
Can we get a rerun?
Just sorry about that. Sorry, if you had a question, you can go ahead and take yourself off mute again. Or pop it into the chat box. But I thought maybe it was just a little bit of background noise. So we do have Gamay. So we can see Gamay blended with Pinot Noir and listed on a label as Pas to Grands. I can pop that into the chat if anybody wants to know that word again. And Aligoté. And I mentioned Aligoté before. If you grew up, with your parents drinking a Kir Royale, usually we're talking about creme de cassis and Aligoté wine. It's a white that is high acid and refreshing. I mentioned Aligoté before because as Burgundy becomes so incredibly expensive, and this has a lot to do with the secondary market. It is not necessarily these producers selling these wines at such high prices, but as we begin to look at the land, you understand that they're very little of a lot of these wines made. That increases the price. Many of these producers are prestigious in their own right for the quality of their winemaking. That raises the price. The weather sucks sometimes in Burgundy, right? We have hail, we have frost, we have storms, we have low yield because of all these things. We have mold and mildew and botrytis. All of these things are bad for grape growing. They lower the yields. We make less wine in these, poor vintage years. That increases the price of the wine. So a lot of producers still want to offer us as consumers value, and a lot of them are turning these days to producing something like aligoté that they can sell at a fraction of the price of their Chardonnay. So if you've always wanted to try some of these, kind of more well-known producers, you might want to try Mikulski, you might want to try Lignier, you might want to try Rouget, right? You can try their aligoté at, let's say, sometimes $25 to $30 a bottle versus, what's their Chardonnay going to be? 50 or plus. So it can be a pretty good value. So how do we organize these appellations? We know the history. We know the grape varieties. Now, why does it get so confusing? Because the history seems pretty easy, right? The grape varieties seem pretty easy, right? Where does it get confusing? Here. The appellations, the organization. Burgundy is the most heavily regulated region in France. It has 84 individual appellations, but in 2015, UNESCO rated 1,274 climats. A climat is an individual vineyard site as UNESCO World Heritage Sites. So we know that's just in the Côte d'Or. So we know that there are thousands of individual sites within Burgundy that have their own names. And sometimes what can also be confusing is that vineyards in different villages can have the same name. It's not uncommon to see Perrier in more than one vineyard, or Cham or Charm in more than one vineyard, right? We have Charm Meursault, we have Gevrey-Chambertin, Chambertin. So it can be a little bit confusing, but today what we're really trying to do is give you the framework to explore Burgundy more on your own. So what is an appellation? In France, regulated by the INAO, an appellation is a named area that you put on your bottle of wine or your food product, right, your agricultural product, that tells you that it comes from a specific place and it's made following the rules of whatever you make in that place. So, for example, so the appellation system, we call it the AOC or the AOP. They mean the same thing, and a producer can use either. So this covers the area. So what is the actual delimited area that you can grow your grapes in order to call your wine Gevrey-Chambertin? What is the grape variety that you can use to call your wine Corton Charlemagne? Spoiler alert, it's Chardonnay. What are the yields? Meaning, how many grapes can you get off of each vine? Lower yields typically should translate to higher quality. The grapes will be more concentrated. They should be more flavorful. Sometimes vine age plays into this too. As you move up the hierarchy ladder in Burgundy, yields are restricted by law. So let's say regional level Burgundy, 55 hectoliters per hectare. Grand Cru Burgundy, 35 hectoliters per hectare. How ripe do your grapes have to be? This protects against kind of green or underripe flavors, especially in this cooler region. What is the vineyard management that you have to use? You must, for example, you must hand harvest in Grand Cru vineyards. And what are the wine making techniques that you need to use, right? We talked about these regions before. Chablis, the Côte d'Or, that's split into two, the Côte Nuits and the Côte Bonne. Côte Chalonnais, Mâcon, also known as Mâcon, and Beaujolais. And now we're going to look at the kind of the hierarchy of how we break down within these individual subregions, these individual climats or sites, right? So we have, I maybe should do this the other way because this is sort of your basic, your entry level, right? Bourgogne Rouge and Bourgogne Blanc. We step up from there into the village level, then into Premier Cru, and then into Grand Cru. So let's take a closer look at that. Any questions before we move on? I'd love to know what you guys are drinking, so please feel free. So how do we organize these appellations? So starting from left to right, as you can see on the screen. So we have Bourgogne, and Burgundy is sort of the English term, of course, for the region of Bourgogne, but they're really trying to bring back sort of the French name, or let the French name be how they call the place, because we don't call any other region in France hardly by an Americanized name, right? Like it's not like Sancerre and then another term for Sancerre that's English, and it's not Bordeaux and then another term, or I guess like Bordelais, but I think that referred to like a person or something coming from the region, right? Like it's not Provence and then another English word for Provence. So you will see either Bourgogne. Some producers do choose, especially on their entry wine, to actually put Burgundy in the English title, but Bourgogne is the appropriate French name for the region. So Bourgogne wines are sort of your entry level category, right? I don't really like to say like basic, because these can be anything but basic wines, but they're just sort of the beginning of the totem pole of quality that we're going to climb as we reach Grand Cru heights. So Bourgogne wines do tend to be your least expensive. You can list a grape variety on the label, but if you don't have a grape variety, it says Bourgogne and it's red, it's Pinot Noir. If you have Bourgogne and it's white, it's Chardonnay. If you said Bourgogne and it's Aligoté, it will list Aligoté on the label itself. So you might see just Bourgogne Rouge, Pinot Noir, or just Bourgogne Blanc, which is Chardonnay. Bourgogne Aligoté will be the Aligoté grape, and Bourgogne Pas du Grand will be a blend of Gamay and Pinot Noir. You already know, because you're smart and you've been listening, that Gamay is grown south of Beaujolais. So what will you list on the label? You're going to actually list Beaujolais, not Burgundy. So Bourgogne wines are a great first step to begin exploring Burgundy. They tend to be the most economical. And this is where we really think about, we study wine so that we can get better wine for less money, right? And this is where it really makes sense, because, for example, most producers, even if they make Grand Cru wine, there's only one producer in all of Burgundy that makes only Grand Cru wine, and that's Bonneau du Martray. So every other producer will probably make every quality level that you see here. So if you are really interested in, producers like Mayo Camusé, they make entry-level Burgundy wine. If you want to see what that producer style is like before you spend, $50, $100, $2,000 on a bottle of wine, then you can check out their entry-level Burgundy. In this case, this is Domaine Fourier that we have here, and they always use old vine material, and their wines are really quite fantastic. Another reason it's smart to know, or important to know, is there are producers who, like Rill, who put Bourgogne on the label for their white, for their Chardonnay, but all the grapes come from Mâcon, and so we'll talk about that. Bourgogne can be sourced from anywhere in Burgundy. We looked at that kind of larger map of the whole region. So if you're making Bourgogne Blanc, you can blend grapes from Chablis in the north and Mâcon in the south and call it Bourgogne Blanc, right? That's why it's important to know those producers like Rill, who are actually making Mâcon, but they're not telling you that on the label. In the village or the village level, this is really where we begin to see the imprint of terroir. So when you see a village listed on the label of Burgundy, whether it's white or red, like Volnay, for example, Volnay as an appellation is only for red wine, so you'll never see Volnay on a village of white wine coming from Burgundy. But you begin to see these single vineyards or single villages listed, and any of the vineyards that are associated with the area of that village can go into this wine. So you might see Volnay, it's a blend of these different vineyards, like here we have from Lafarge, that are associated with the village of Volnay. That makes sense, right? You also might see a Lieu-dit on the label, which is a named parcel of land that's not a Premier Cru, like we have here, or a Grand Cru. So you might see something like, I'm gonna say like Comte d'Orvaux, which is also, which is a Premier Cru, or it might be a Lieu-dit. Let me think of another one. I'll think of something, but you might see a piece, something listed on a label. It's a parcel of land. All the grapes come from that Lieu-dit, but it's not a Premier Cru or a Grand Cru, so you don't have it listed here. Climbing the ladder, now we're at Premier Cru, right? Premier Cru falls into the village level category. So that means all Premier Cru grapes have to come from an individual village. Can we have Burgundy, generic Burgundy Premier Cru? No, you cannot. Can you have a village Premier Cru that doesn't list a vineyard? You can. You might see this somewhere like Mâcon, where a producer might be blending, like Côte, is blending grapes from their different Premier Cru vineyards within the village of Mâcon, right? So because it's multiple vineyards, they're still just putting the term Premier Cru, like you see here, along with just the name of the village, which would be Mâcon on the label. You can also have all of your Premier Cru grapes come from a single Premier Cru vineyard. And in this case, you see that with this label, this is Mâcon again, Cros Parent 2, only two producers, I think, Emmanuel Rouget today and Mâcon, that own pieces of Cros Parent 2 and make wine from that. You can see here, Premier Cru, Vosne Romani is the village, Cros Parent 2 is the vineyard itself, the Premier Cru vineyard within this village of Vosne Romani. Sorry, I'm being like repeating, but I'm like, you know, so specific. I don't want to get it wrong. So I apologize if I'm being a little bit redundant sometimes with the terminology, but I think it's important. At the top of the hierarchy, we have Grand Cru. This is the Mac Daddy. This is the epitome. This is why everybody wants to drink Burgundy. 50 years ago, you could drink Grand Cru Burgundy at a reasonable price. You can't do that anymore today. I also sometimes like to look at the negociants for the Grand Cru Burgundies, because they typically, not always, but typically negociant wines sell for less money than domain wines. So you would have more of the opportunity to try, you know, maybe the 9 Grand Crus of Gevrey-Chambertin next to each other. So these are single villages, or excuse me, single vineyards that are so famous, they're granted their own appellation. You do not need to list a village with a Grand Cru vineyard. You cannot blend multiple Grand Cru vineyards and list it as just Burgundy Grand Cru. If you list Grand Cru on your label, it has to come from a single vineyard in a single village. Now, what you could do, and just as a side note, not to confuse everybody, but you can decide that you want to blend Grand Cru fruit, although why would you? Because again, you can charge thousands of dollars for that bottle. You might decide you want to blend it. Could you then make that wine and sell it? Yes, you could, but you would have to declassify that wine down to whatever you could declassify it to. So if you were blending a couple different Grand Cru vineyards, let's say Chambertin and Chambertin and Gevrey-Chambertin, you can't use Grand Cru. You have to declassify that wine to simply a village wine of Gevrey-Chambertin. Make sense? Down here at the bottom, you can see a single producer, kind of the progression of quality. This is Leflaive. They're located in Pouligny-Montrachet, a village known for the quality of its white wines, with 4 Grand Crus in the Côte de Beaune, which we'll talk about. And you can see how confusing this can be, right? Now, this is why a sommelier brings you a bottle of wine to review when you order it, because there are places like Burgundy where a single producer makes different styles of wine. The labels are almost identical, right? So you want to make sure when that sommelier brings you a wine, if you order Montrachet Grand Cru and you're spending $700 for that bottle, that they're not accidentally, you know, not on purpose, of course, because that would be terrible, bringing you a bottle of their Bourgogne Blanc, right, which you would be paying $70 for. So you have entry, your kind of Bourgogne regional level. You have your village, Pouligny-Montrachet. Here you have Pouligny-Montrachet Premier Cru. That is a single vineyard, Clavillon. And then you have your Montrachet Grand Cru, all coming from Leflaive. And Claude Leflaive was one of the first proponents of biodynamics in Burgundy as well. And then this is just a quick map, not to spend too much time here, but just so you can see, again, the progression. So this is the Côte Nuits here. The purple vineyards are your Grand Cru vineyards. You can see how few of those there are. Bourgogne is the largest. Your Premier Cru is your kind of pinkish red here. Your village level, as you get more, the Côte Nuits village, which is another appellation. And then out here we have the Bourgogne au Côte Nuits, which you also will see on labels as well. Red wine, and typically, again, sort of more entry level for Burgundy regional wine. Here you can see a single village. This is Gevrey-Chambertin that we have located over here. You can see the slope of Grand Crus. We're going to talk about that in a second. The Premier Crus, and then the sort of AOC village level wine. So these would all be labeled with the individual Grand Cru. We have, Cazetier, you have Chambertin, you have Chambertin Clotilde, you have Mâcon. These would be your individual Premier Cru vineyard, which you would label as Premier Cru with the vineyard name, or you would blend the Premier Cru and just label it as Premier Cru. And then everything else would just be Gevrey-Chambertin, right? And then here you see another quick map of these vineyards, these Grand Cru vineyards that are all located, as you notice, in a single slope here on the hillside, which we'll talk about. Gevrey-Chambertin has the most Grand Cru vineyards within Burgundy in their village, which is why we use it as an example a lot. So what is the soil like? What's the terroir like? What's the exposure? This is really what makes these Grand Crus come in these blocks along the slope, as you see. So we are in a continental climate. We talked about that. We don't have the influence of the sea. The Côte d'Or, the Côte Nuits, and the Côte Beaune is located on a fault line, and it, with the shifting of tectonic plates, pushed up this golden slope. That's what we call it, the Côte d'Or, the golden slope. Now, in the Côte d'Or, the exposure is primarily southeast, and this is important because in this cool continental northern climate, this allows us to access the power of the sun, right? And typically, we look at where these vineyards are on the slope. We're going to look at this in a second. For which ones are the Grand Cru vineyards? What are the Premier Cru? What are the village level? And where we might find just our regional Burgundy AOC. We primarily have marine, limestone, and marl. This is important. At one time, this was a very shallow and warm sea. It's important not just that it was a sea at one time, but also that it was shallow. So we have a lot of sunlight during this sort of more tropical period, this Jurassic period, that had a lot of sea life, right? We have the shallow sea, a lot of sunshine, really vibrant sea life. And in Burgundy and a lot of places in northern France, Champagne and Loire Valley, Sancerre, and places like that, we classify the soil type by the marine life that is primarily embedded in it now. We have pretty cold winters, we mentioned before. We have a lot of frost in the fall and the spring. This shortened the growing season. But we do have pretty warm, temperate summers. But we're going to talk about the vintages and kind of the importance of that as well. This is just, I think, visuals helps, right? So when we think about Burgundy, these are gentle slopes. These kind of coats mean slopes. It's not like the Mosel in Germany. It's not like where we grow wine for port, the Douro Valley in Portugal, these really steep slopes that are difficult to work. We have pretty soft rolling slopes here within the region. And you can see that if we have the village down here, the best slopes are usually, the best vineyards are usually located in the center of the slope. At the top, the soils are a little bit poorer. It's colder. We don't have the protection of the slope against the elements. So we don't see as much ripening here within this area. There's a lot of erosion, but they're still pretty good sites. So we typically see more of the Premier Cru wines at the top of the slope, these vineyards. In the mid slope, this is the best area. They get the best sunlight exposure, the most concentration, as you can see here, kind of concentrated on the side of the slope. They have the best drainage in terms of the water that drains from the top as it rains. And it tends to be the best temperature-wise for the ripening of the grapes. Down around the village, we see the village level wines. And then on the flatter plain where we have richer soils, which are not as great for grapevine, where we have more water retention, which is also not great for grapevine. This is where you tend to see your more Burgundy levels. So this is a very kind of basic but common way that we see the vineyards themselves divided up on the slopes of Burgundy. All right, let's talk about some regions. We can talk about regions all day, but I really, like I said, you know, the reason that we do these classes is almost to make our own job obsolete. It's to give you the necessary tools, right? So that you can go to a restaurant and confidently order wine. You can confidently talk to a sommelier about what you're interested in, how much you want to spend on a bottle of wine. Like, how important is that, right? There's nothing worse than buyer's remorse when somebody talks you into a bottle of wine that you don't like. How to understand what you like and then be able to translate and describe that to whoever you're purchasing wine from, a sommelier, an associate at a wine shop. So I really think the foundation for Burgundy is incredibly important to have the tools to begin to explore it on your own. All right, so in Chablis, hopefully you're drinking the Clotilde de Vigne. This is one of our favorite producers. Also, you know, of course, we always want to promote female producers as well. There's fewer female producers in the world of wine than there are male producers. But we're really seeing in France, I love that a lot of daughters are really taking over these days, or also women are just starting their own winery, which is really cool. So in Chablis, Chablis is 100% Chardonnay. It will not be anything else. There's a region in Burgundy that makes Sauvignon Blanc. It's called Saint Brie. You rarely see it because it's consumed locally. We don't, when we look at a bottle that says Saint Brie, we don't really usually know what that means as consumers in the US. So we would rather probably drink something like Puy-Fumé or Sancerre, right? So Chablis itself, 100% Chardonnay. This is your most usually austere expression. When people say, I don't like Chardonnay because I don't like oak, I like to give them Chablis and see what they think. We have a lot of the Kimmeridgian limestone soil here. Again, that marine life limestone that we see. The wines are high acid, they're mineral driven. Usually we don't see oak in Chablis. Some producers will use a little bit of oak, but the majority really focus on the site, and they don't want to mar the sort of site specificity, especially in this region where we don't develop in these grapes because it's not as warm, the riper bombastic flavors that we need to support oak, right? So we have different levels of quality that we see here. The entry level would be Petit Chablis. Petit Chablis is typically made on like higher western facing slopes that don't get as much exposure to sunlight. They're planted on a soil that's called Portlandian, which is a little bit younger than the Kimmeridgian that we really prefer for the Grand Crus of Chablis. We do have villages within Chablis, but we don't list village wine in Chablis the same way we do in the Côte d'Or, as we were discussing. But importantly, we do see Premier Crus and Grand Crus. And the Premier Crus are really, I think, some of the most important sites within Chablis because one, they really offer the aspect of terroir at an affordable nature. The Grand Crus can be quite a bit more expensive, and there are really 17 kind of main Premier Crus that you see on bottles. There are 40 that can be used, but sometimes when Premier Crus adjoin each other or butt each other, a producer can choose which one to use, and obviously in terms of marketing, they usually use the more well-known one. So as this goes on, some of the lesser Premier Crus or lesser known are used less and less. So 17 major Premier Crus, but I mean, we see Vieilles, we see Montmain, we see Forcham, we see Monté des Tonnerres for Premier Crus. And then in terms of Grand Crus, Grand Cru in Chablis is a little bit different than what we see in the Côte d'Or, more further south in Burgundy. So Grand Cru is one. There's one Grand Cru in Chablis with 7 climats, right? We talked about climat earlier. It's an important term. There's 7 individual climats within the region. So you can see them, you know, you have Prusse, you have Les Clos, which is really important. You have Valmore, Grenouille, which is also really important. All of these 7 different climats that you see that will be listed like that on a label. So this is an example here. This is Francois Ravenot, Laura's favorite Chablis producer, also outrageously expensive. I mean, we're talking like, it's not uncommon to see a bottle of Grand Cru Ravenel for $900 on a wine list. And it's just an astounding amount of money for a bottle of Chardonnay. But the wine, this is one of the best producers. It's imported by Kermit Lynch. Kermit Lynch was only able to convince this man to export his wine when Kermit promised. He's a natural wine producer, always has been. When Kermit promised to ship his wines in temperature controlled containers. So really important producers that we do see here making these Grand Cru wines, these 7 different climats. But certainly I think Premier Cru is a great place to hang out in Chablis. Drink Chablis Premier Cru wines. We've been talking about the Côte de Nuits already. We know that it's mostly Pinot Noir. They make rosé out of Pinot Noir. They make Chardonnay out of Gamay. They make they make Chardonnay. They make white wine out of Chardonnay. They make white wine out of Aligoté. But they're really known for the quality of their Pinot Noir and their red wine. The Côte de Nuits is a red wine area. We have the major villages with the Premier Cru, Grand Cru, and village level sites located within them, right? So just kind of briefly, we'll run through these villages. In the north, we have Marcenay. Marcenay has no Premier Cru and no Grand Cru, but it's a really great village level wine. So you might see the village Marcenay listed with a Lieu-dit. So it won't say Premier Cru or Grand Cru, but you know that that's a specialized plot of land that has been recognized by the French government as producing a style of wine that is more singular, right? We also see quite a bit of rosé from Pinot Noir coming out of Marcenay. One of the most well-known areas for rosé within Burgundy altogether. Moving further south, we have Gevrey-Chambertin. This is the area with our 9 Grand Crus that we talked about. It's an important side note. Why do we have these hyphenated village names in Burgundy? In the mid 1800s, the village of Gevrey was granted permission by the king to append the name of its most famous vineyard, which is Chambertin, a Grand Cru vineyard, onto its name. Now, the idea of this is to give Gevrey more recognition as a great wine producing village. But another idea is that previously producers were listing, were saying things like, this is even before appellation law, but producers were still listing terms on their barrels of wine, right? Telling you that this wine comes from a specific place and probably tastes like the wine should from that place. So Gevrey appended the name of their most important vineyard, which was Chambertin, onto the name of their village. And this allowed producers that didn't own vines within the Grand Cru or Premier Cru vineyard to kind of capitalize on the Chambertin name, right? It can be confusing for us, but now that we've gone through the hierarchy, you know how to separate the village of Gevrey-Chambertin from the Premier Cru and the Grand Cru, right? Gevrey is known for powerful, dark fruit expressions of Pinot Noir. Moving further south, we have Maurice Saint-Denis. Maurice Saint-Denis has 5 Grand Crus. Maurice with the village, they appended the name of their most important important Grand Cru vineyard, Clos Saint-Denis, onto their name, as you can see here. Maurice Saint-Denis is a style in between Gevrey-Chambertin and Chambolle-Musigny, which Chambolle-Musigny tends to be lighter, softer, more floral and fragrant expressions of Pinot Noir. Sometimes we say feminine and masculine, but they do tend to be a little bit lighter, fresher acidity, softer, and not as powerful as Gevrey-Chambertin. Maurice Saint-Denis is right in between those two. A great producer in Maurice Saint-Denis include Ponceau and Dujac are really important within this area as well. And further south, we have the Vougeot, the village. Clotilde Vougeot, single Grand Cru in this village. This is one of the largest Grand Crus in Burgundy with more than 80 producers. So just because the wine says Grand Cru isn't always enough. Sometimes you have to know the producer too. And, a lot of times, let's say you're buying wine from Santa Barbara, California, and somebody's like, oh, this producer, Tyler makes this wine in a Burgundian style. And when you're talking about these wines in a warmer place like California, you understand the concept that we're probably saying this wine is more food friendly. It has fresher acidity, less use of oak like we have in Burgundy. But you also have to take that into account with a grain of salt, because there are as many Burgundian wine styles as there are Burgundian producers, right? So we take that into account with the Grand Cru of Clos de Vougeot, which has over 80 producers making wine from it. Rhone Romani, as we're moving further south, this is the epitome of Pinot Noir in Burgundy. This is where you want to hang out. If you're going to move somewhere, if you want to spend all of your money on wine for the rest of your life, go to Rhone Romani. The wines are finesse, they're long lived, they have a lot of precision. The most expensive wines in the world are made here, Domaine de la Romanie Conti. Now, one thing we haven't talked about is the concept of a monopole in Burgundy. So we already know that we have négociants because multiple owners work within one vineyard, right? Well, some vineyards have only one owner, and those are known as monopoles. So in Rhone Romani, we have 6 Grand Cru vineyards, and of those 6 Grand Cru vineyards, 4 are monopoles, meaning 4 of those vineyards that are Grand Cru, only one producer makes wine from them. So Domaine de la Romanie Conti, for example, makes wine from Romani Conti, and La Tâche, the only producer, Ligier Belair, the only producer of La Romanie, La Marche, the only producer of La Grande Rue. You may not remember all of this, but that's fine. But just understand that there are monopole producers. What does that do? That also raises the price of the wine. Nuits Saint-Georges, no Grand Cru vineyards in Nuits Saint-Georges, but more than 40 Premier Cru vineyards. And this is really important because Nuits Saint-Georges is a great place for quality red Burgundy. It had so many Premier Cru vineyards and no Grand Cru vineyards because Henri Gouge is a producer that was the mayor of Nuits Saint-Georges when they were coming up with the appellation system and outlining the laws in the 1930s. And because he owned his own vineyards and because he was the mayor, he thought that there would be a conflict of interest to suggest any of the vineyards within Nuits Saint-Georges for Grand Cru status. So if not for that, some of the vineyards in Nuits Saint-Georges might be Grand Cru. But also one of those tidbits to help us drink better wine for less money, because it's not Grand Cru, though the quality is Grand Cru, but the price is Premier Cru or village level, right? So we like those things. Moving south into the Côte de Beaune. And we only have a few more moments together, but we're gonna run through this pretty quickly here. We go a few minutes after, feel free to jump off and catch the rest on the recording later. So moving further south, we're in the Côte de Beaune. We've flipped, right? The other side, yin and yang. Now we're in Chardonnay country. Do we make Pinot Noir in the Côte de Beaune? Yes, we do. But they're known for the quality of their white wine from Chardonnay. So we're in the southern half here. All of the white Grand Cru vineyards are here in the Côte de Beaune. I didn't mention there's only one white Grand Cru vineyard in the Côte de Nuits, and that would be the vineyard of Musigny. All of the other vineyards that are Grand Cru in the Côte de Nuits in the north all only produce Pinot Noir. So Musigny in the north in the Côte de Nuits can make Chardonnay and Pinot Noir Grand Cru wine. So you'll see white and red Grand Cru wines in Musigny. In the Côte de Beaune, only the Grand Cru of Corton can produce both white and red Grand Cru wine. I hope that makes sense. We see a little bit more clay as we're moving south. This clay is what gives Chardonnay coming from this region a richer and weightier palate. And depending on how much clay there is in the vineyards of these individual villages or these individual Grand or Premier Cru villages really changes the effect, right, of the wines themselves. So as we're moving from the north, we have the Hill of Corton. This is a really important area. We have Corton and Corton Charlemagne are two really important areas. Corton Charlemagne is for white wines only. As we move further south, we move into Pommard and Bolnay, and these are both excellent villages for red wine. So they're both villages where you can only produce, if you're using Pommard and Bolnay on the label as an appellation, they can only be red wine. They have no Grand Crus, but quite a few Premier Crus within the area. Beaune itself, you'll see wine coming from Beaune. It's also kind of the commerce center of Burgundy. A lot of the negotiant houses are located here. Between Pommard and Volnay, Pommard will usually be the fuller, more tannic style of Pinot Noir, more clay in the soil. Volnay is lighter, has softer wines. We have a little bit more kind of limestone here, so you don't get quite the weight that you get out of Pommard. Soil, can you taste dirt in your wine? Well, sometimes Burgundy wines taste earthy, right? But you can't taste the dirt or you can't taste the rock. But what it does do is it creates a particular texture in terms of the palate. As we move south, this is where we really start seeing a lot of our Chardonnay. In Meursault, which is known for the quality of its Premier Cru wine, there are no Grand Cru wines within Meursault. We're talking about richer, voluptuous, more nutty whites. And this Chardonnay, of course, is not as voluptuous as something you get in Russian River Valley in California, where the climate's much different. But in context of Burgundy, these are your richer, slightly more bombastic style of wine for the region. In Meursault, it has a lower water table, so they have larger cellars. This allows for larger aging in oak underground, or longer aging in oak underground, right? So we get a little bit more of these kind of like oatmeal and hazelnut characteristic to the wine sometimes, and the veneer of oak, a little bit more of that cinnamon and spice. As we move south to Pouligny-Montrachet and Chassagne-Montrachet. So why do these two villages, Chassagne and Pouligny, both get to use the vineyard of Montrachet? Well, because the vineyard of Montrachet is attributed to both villages. So they both appended the most famous vineyard, Montrachet, to their name. Pouligny is considered to be the world's best white wine. The most prestigious Chardonnay, the wines are taut and racy. They're incredibly long-lived. You can be drinking Pouligny-Montrachet wine back to the 1980s, even the 1970s, if they've been stored correctly. Chassagne-Montrachet is weightier and makes slightly broader whites. You also see more red wine in Chassagne-Montrachet, but as a village, because if you're using any of the Grand Crus that are in Chassagne-Montrachet, which would be Montrachet, of course, which is shared with Pouligny, Criote, Bertard Montrachet, or Bertard Montrachet, what can you be? You can only be white wine. So Pouligny, Chassagne, known for their Grand Cru vineyards. All of them have something to do with the term Montrachet, right? The Montrachet, Bienvenue, Bertard Montrachet. You have Chevalier Montrachet, Bertard Montrachet, and Criote, Bertard Montrachet. So out of those, they're either shared or in one or the other of Pouligny and Chassagne. The Côte Chalonnais, a much cooler region, we mentioned this before, non-contiguous, less dependent on the grapevine. This is a wonderful, wonderful place for value wines. The Burgundy at your $20, $15, $20 price point, the wine can be really fantastic. The village of Bourgogne is the only AOC specifically for the Aligoté grape within Burgundy. Aubert de Villaine lives here. He used to be the mayor. He's also the owner of Domaine de la Romanée Conti, one of the most expensive wines from one of the most prestigious wineries in the world. The Domaine de la Romanée Conti is located within the village of Beaune-Romanie, but Aubert and his American wife, Pamela, live in the Côte Chalonnais in Bourgogne. So they also make wine here. It's under the label Domaine Villaine. So if you've always wanted to know what wine from a winemaker that sells for $10,000 a bottle tastes like, you don't have to buy that $10,000 bottle of wine. You can go to the wine shop and ask for Domaine Villaine, and they have mostly Aligoté from Bourgogne, but they also make Pinot Noir and I think Chardonnay coming from this region too. Does that mean that it's the same as the wine coming from Beaune-Romanie? Well, of course it's not, because we're in Burgundy, we're talking about the terroir, right? So it's a different terroir, but you have wine made from that prestigious winemaker for $25, $40 instead of $10,000. So I highly recommend that. In Mâcon, this is a really exciting area for Chardonnay, Chardonnay country. We have 22 Premier Crus that were recognized for inclusion in 2020. We don't have time to go into why they weren't recognized earlier on, but let's just say this is really kind of the prestigious area, and they wanted, we'll go into that another time because it's a little bit too long of a story. But if anybody has a question, maybe I'll include it in follow-up notes tomorrow. So Mâcon is known for Chardonnay. It's a great area for value Chardonnay. So I mentioned before, because the wine, the Burgundy, are so expensive on the secondary market, not only are producers making things like aligoté that they can still sell for less expensive, a lot of them are also making wine in Mâcon. So some of the most famous winemakers in places like Meursault, places, people like Dominique Lafon, Laflèvre, they're coming down here and they're making wine in the Mâconnais. So just like Aubert de Villaine and his wine coming from the Côte Chalonnais, you can have some of these really prestigious estates for, pennies by comparison in Mâconnais. Same winemakers, same estate, same families making the wine. So it's a pretty exciting region to look for. And I can send out some of those, really kind of fun ideas too. Fantastic. So Beaujolais, we're going to leave on this. We're going to talk a little bit about the wines that you're drinking. I haven't seen any questions pop up yet, but I'll check in 1 second. So Beaujolais, what's the grape? We already know this, right? So here we're talking about Gamay. This is a monoculture, really, of Gamay. I think almost 99% of the wine here, you can make Bourgogne Blanc from Chardonnay within this region, but if you're making Gamay, it's going to say Beaujolais. Now in Beaujolais, the way we organize the appellations is that there are 10 crus. Now these are not Grand Crus or Premier Crus. In Beaujolais, they're simply known as crus, but they're named for their own places because, again, just like the individual climats further north in Burgundy, they really epitomize their own sort of soil and style of the Gamay grape, right? So from north to south, we have Saint-Amour, Julianas, Chenin, Moulin-à-Vent, Fleurie, Chardonnay, Bourgogne, Renier, Brouilly, the largest, and then the Côte Brouilly here as well. You can also get Beaujolais Village, of which several village sites are authorized to use Beaujolais Village on the label. And then you have it, your kind of regional or basic quality would be just Beaujolais. So you have Beaujolais AOC at the bottom, then you have Beaujolais Village is a step up. And then at the highest quality of Beaujolais, you might see one of your 10 individual crus located on that label. So it's common to see Bourgogne, it's common to see Moulin-à-Vent. If you want to, again, kind of look at the different producers or the different crus in Beaujolais, it's much less expensive to do that with Gamay here than it is to do it with Pinot Noir in somewhere like Gevrey-Chambertin or Vosne-Romanée. How are we doing, guys? That was a lot, right? But so fun. I love talking about Burgundy. It really is so helpful once you begin to understand the lay of the land and how the appellation system works. And you don't need to know the character of every climat in Burgundy. What you need to understand to begin it is that just to begin the understanding is the understanding of these grape varieties, Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, how the appellation system works so that you're not really confused why last week you bought, again, Laflèvre Bourgogne at $70 and then you went somewhere else to buy Laflèvre, but it was their Montrachet and it was $700, right? So this can really help demystify some of why Burgundy is the way it is. And once we've demystified why it is the way it is, what the grapes are, what the appellations are, what we can expect, and how we can explore the region through different producers and through different individual sites, I think it really helps us along in our journey. So we thought it'd be really fun to do Chablis today. Coming from the north, 2018 is a warmer year in Chablis, but Clotilde, I think, really managed to keep a lot of vibrancy in this particular wine. One of the things about Chardonnay, especially coming from Chablis, is it typically goes through a process during winemaking called malolactic fermentation. So we just call it like ML or MLF. And what this does is it creates a little bit of that kind of creamy, sometimes slightly buttery texture that you oftentimes get with Chardonnay. Because a lot of times we practice that character, that kind of malolactic fermentation with Chardonnay to build texture and to build richness. And in a really northern climate like Chablis, this also helps to soften some of the really tart acidity that you might get from that really cool climate, right? So we do see, I think, more flavors here. You get a lot of citrus, kind of Meyer lemon, you have green apple. There's a little bit of what I like about this wine particularly is it has, and this is common for Chablis in general, a slight herbal quality to it. So sometimes we say, because we talk about creaminess and we talk about herbs, so sometimes we say like the weirdest thing, but in the best way possible, like sour cream and chive potato chips for Chablis. A little bit of creaminess, but a little bit of herbiness too. Aniseed, sometimes we say a little bit of chervil or kind of a fresh springtime herb within these wines. You have wine left, I hope, but if you don't, that's fine too. What are you going to have this with tonight? I mean, oysters. Think about the bright acidity. Anything you would squeeze a lemon over, you can pair with Chablis, right? Oysters, shellfish, salty food, fried food, snails, and butter and parsley are incredibly popular within Burgundy. Fresh cheeses that you might find within the area. But maybe you want to drink red tonight. Suddenly, if you're in New York, it got really cold in like the past 3 hours. Like I had to turn the heat on after these last 2 kind of pretty days, right? Or maybe they're a little rainy, but I'm from Washington, so rain is fine with me. So they're a little rainy, but it was warm, right? So maybe you want to drink red tonight. This is an old vine, Pinot Noir. And now you've noticed too that I've listed the wines the way that I would list them, the way that you would probably see them on a wine list or the way that you would see the label. And because the wine is Chablis, they don't list the grape variety, right? They call it Chablis because now we know that Chablis can only be Chardonnay. Now we know that Chablis is a northern climate within France. It's a cooler climate, so we know that that will result in a fresher wine with brighter acidity, less abundant fruit, right? So Chablis is kind of telling us what in France, what Chardonnay would tell us on a label in America, for example. Same thing here. Do we list the grape? No, because it's coming from Gevrey-Chambertin. Can Gevrey-Chambertin produce as a village white wine? Yes, they can, but we look at the bottle, it's clear glass, and we know that it's red. So Vieilles means old vine in French. It is not necessarily a regulated term, but usually in Burgundy, we're thinking 30 years or more. Why is this important? Just like those lower yield we talked about, older vines produce more concentrated grapes, more concentrated flavors, more concentrated structure within the wine. This is a very, very small estate as well. Rémi Jeanniard is a very humble man, as are many of the vignerons coming from Burgundy. If you go to Bordeaux, your winemaker is going to meet you with, manicured hands and a Brook Brothers suit or whatever they wear in France. In Burgundy, he'll probably walk out of the cellar with dirt under his nails, wearing his rain boots because he was just in the vineyard itself. So it's a very different kind of culture and atmosphere around the grapevine. It's 100% Pinot Noir. It comes from vine planted in 1945, so these are definitely old vines. They are hand harvested just like you would do for Grand Cru wines, although this is just a village level wine. 20% whole bunches. What do I mean by that? They take some of the stems of the grape and they use that during fermentation. That adds a little bit of structure on the palate and spice to the wine. This is a very common technique in Burgundy to add more oomph on the palate to Pinot Noir. Pinot Noir is a low tannin grape, and incorporating some or all of the stem during fermentation can help build a little bit of that structure. But what do you have here? You have that herbal character, you have that fennel, you have strawberry, you have cherry, you have vanilla. What are you having tonight with this? If you're like, it's cold out, it's going to be, like 40 degrees tomorrow in New York. Coq au vin, right? Chicken cooked in red wine, beef bourguignon, ripe cheeses, things like épois. These are all really common foods that you might see in Burgundy. And we always love to say what grows together goes together because they evolved naturally over time. Are those the only things that go together? Of course not, but let's make it easy and foolproof. Tomorrow, I'm going to go ahead and send out the vintages, just so I don't keep you all night here forever. But essentially, I broke the vintages down into kind of classic years for Burgundy. Cooler years would tend to bring more acidic wine that tend to actually age a little bit longer, but need time to develop and soften in the bottle. And then warmer vintages produce wines that are better for earlier or immediate drinking, but they don't have as much longevity in the bottle themselves. All right, how are we doing, everybody? I didn't see any questions. I don't know if I just missed them over time, or if you guys just know all of these great things about Burgundy already, which is what I hope. So thank you, everybody. We'll go ahead and send, again, I'll send a follow-up note, so you'll have those things like vintages and the information that you have in the slides. I'll send out a copy of the recording. I know we went over a lot, but as I kind of mentioned in the email, Burgundy is really anything but basic, right? But I think it's important to break it down at the base level and build up from there. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out, okay? Enjoy your night, enjoy your wines, and I'll see you all soon. Thanks, Catherine. Glad you got the wines. Hi, Venkat. All right, good night, Andrew. See you guys.